Everybody take a breath. Just take a breath and soak that in before we go any further. Thank you, Stephanie. That was powerful. Wow. Um, so take a breath. And while you do that, I'm going to get my screen up. Yeah. Hope everybody can see it. Um, so I love that this conversation is happening. I love that I'm following Stephanie, um, because we're really, what I want to do is I'm going to take us up a level and really look at the economy and really do a diagnosis of the economy that I hopefully will feed into the next conversation that you all are going to have about policy. And I've been working around this nexus of race and the economy my whole career, and I've come to the conclusion that everything that I was told, everything that I knew about the economy and how it affects Black and brown people, indigenous people, and other people of color is that I've been lied to, that it's all a lie. The story that been told is one that is untrue. And I know this because, and much of what I learned about the economy came from, trying to figure out how to go to the next slide. This man right here, this is my father. I'm lucky enough to still have my father in my life. And when I was young, this is him and my brothers, he taught us about the economy. He taught us about how the economy worked. He was a union bus driver in St. Paul, Minnesota. And, he taught us about, you got to work hard. You got to get a good education. You gotta want more than the next guy. You gotta work harder than the next person to get ahead. And like, he instilled all these values in us. And not only did he instill them, he demonstrated them. I mean, he worked 70 hours a week. He worked the evening shift. He drove the routes that nobody wanted to drive. Like, I used to think that like my dad's bus driver uniform was just the clothes that he liked to wear. He was in it so much. And what wasn't sticking with me, what I always struggled with was like, if all this was true, we should be millionaires because nobody worked harder than this man in my life. And if hard work was the pathway so I've always had these questions like, why is it that what I've been told by this person that I trust more than anybody in the world just isn't matching my observations of the world? And as I got older and got into understanding economic policy, there was something that illuminated for me, and it's that systemic racism is what drives our economy. And I'll give you an example from, again, my hometown and my own experience. So this is a redlining map of St. Paul, Minnesota, and I know there are a bunch of urban planners on this call, so they know this history of redlining, right? It was financial resources, bank resources for housing, small businesses, community development activities were provided in parts of the city that were either in green or blue or yellow, and communities that were in red did not get any of those resources. They were choked off from those resources. They were not given those resources. And the communities in the red in many places across the country happened to be Black and brown communities, that those were Black and brown communities that weren't getting these resources. And I'm from a place called Rondo. And the rationale for why you wouldn't do this is because from a public policy standpoint is that, there's no money to be gained by the banks in these communities. Well, what I was told about my own community is that there were small businesses in my community, that there were vibrant restaurants, that there were vibrant grocery stores, that there was churches, that there was a lot of economic activity in our communities, but it wasn't being generated by any finances that was going to banks. So it was a systematic decision not to make investments in our communities. So this is that redlining map of my community, when redlining was happening. This is what my community looks like today in St. Paul, Minnesota. There was a main street in Rondo called Rondo Avenue, and in 1965 they plowed that neighborhood and built a highway. And the reason that they could do that was because of the systemic disinvestment in that community over time. And understanding this history and learning this history illuminated for me that like this is purposeful and is systemic, that the reasons why people don't have money and don't have resources is not because they're not working hard enough, not educated enough, not because of all these things that my father told me. It's because systems that the government created purposely put people in a place of economic disenfranchisement. And it creates a truth that we have to acknowledge before we can take any step forward. And that's that we are operating in an oppression economy. Our economy today is systemically, purposely oppressing Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and many immigrant communities on purpose, because racism is profitable, racism creates wealth and for the elite, and racism is to blame for the economic disenfranchisement that people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives. It is not any of these other reasons. It is racism and racism alone. And the way that we know this is because we can observe it through what we call a cycle of oppression. And this cycle of oppression, you can apply any public policy to, and it will play itself out over and over again. And it starts with this truth that racism is profitable, and that the profitability of racism is what creates economic suppression, where Black and brown people have higher unemployment rates, have lower wealth, have lower incomes, have less access to services, are unhealthy. It is this economic oppression that creates these truths. And that is tied to a suppression of our political power. We aren't able to vote. We aren't able to participate equally in the democratic process because we don't have the money to put into PACs and a lot of the other things that move our democracy. And because of that, we can't influence our democracy at the same way. And our inability to influence the democracy is what allows racism to continue to be profitable. So I'm going to provide an example of how this can be applied to what is often considered just a racial justice issue, but I actually think is an economic issue, and that is the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex is a $182 billion a year industry that includes private prisons, it includes services that go into public prisons, it includes contracts for policing, it includes immigration facilities, it includes a whole lot of money from the private sector that is created to uplift our carceral state that is largely exists to imprison Black and brown people. People coming out of that system have an unemployment rate of 27%. That is a higher unemployment rate than any time for the general public during the Great Depression or even during this economic crisis that we're currently going through. There are 40 states that have some prohibition for formerly incarcerated people in their ability to vote. Some sort of prohibition. There are only 3 places where you have that right unaltered. That is Maine, Vermont, and the District of Columbia. Other than the District of Columbia, you can see the demographics of those states, Maine and Vermont. Largely low populations of people of color. And because of that, 1.6 million formerly incarcerated people have no access to influencing the democracy that they are a part of. How could they have any economic opportunity if they don't even have the ability to influence the democracy that orients how our economy works? This oppression economy I'm talking about is historic. Our economy came to be at the same time as a racial caste system that allows elite institutions, the very wealthy, to steal, exclude, and exploit people of color. It started when the first settlers were here, and with mass genocide and removal of indigenous people from their own land, continue on to Black people whose labor was stolen from them during slavery and then later exploited throughout Jim Crow, and immigrant communities that still today have their labor exploited in farm fields, in meatpacking plants, and a whole host of other industries. This cycle plays itself out and continues and has historic roots that are deeply embedded in our economy. So what do? I want to get to what do we do about this. We have to do two things from my perspective. We have to dismantle what we call the oppression economy and build what we call a liberation economy. The dismantling of the oppression economy really has four dimensions. And I think the public policy platform that you are going to talk about are going to have some elements of many of the things that I'm going to talk about here during this part of the talk. We have to end the criminalization of people of color. As I said, people cannot fully participate in the economy if they are consistently and perpetually criminalized. And communities cannot thrive if they are policed as if they are part of some occupation, government occupation, and not as if they are participants in the country and in the economy. We have to end our dual financial system. We cannot have one financial system that builds wealth for one class of people and strips and exploits and takes wealth away from another class of people, largely people of color. You know, you go into some communities, there are more payday lenders than there are McDonald's, Burger King, or Starbucks. That's an example of that type of dynamic. We have to curb corporate power. Corporations have way too much power to influence our democracy, and because of that, workers don't have nearly enough power to influence their own working conditions, their own pay, or their own feelings about the type of things that the corporations they work for should be doing in the communities that they live in. And then finally, we have to end political suppression. Like, we cannot change the route of the economy if we are not involved and able to fully participate in the politics, because the government is the one that writes the rules, and we should have, we by nature of our existence should have influence over those rules. But then we have to move to building a liberation economy. And within this are the type of public policies, again, that I believe you're going to talk about in your policy session. And that those policies have to provide, again, four basic things. All people have their basic needs met. Yes, this is income. This is being able to pay your bills, but it's also being able to breathe clean air, drink clean water, to live in a community where the ground is not polluted, live in a community that is not going to be just torn away by climate change. These are all basic needs that all people should be able to have, and that all people of color should be able to have. That we have safety and security. And safety and security, of course, are things like living in a safe community, but it's also having a roof over your head. It's about having financial stability so that, you know, when the ebbs and flows of the economy happen, you're going to be protected and you're going to be whole and you're going to be okay. You have some modicum of wealth that you can look to be able to manage things in tough times, and a modicum of wealth that you can pass on to your children so that they get a head start on life when they become adults. That all contributions that people of color make are valued in the economy and valued with compensation. That if you want to work, you can work. And when you do work, that job pays a livable wage that you can live on. And that we acknowledge work in this economy that is currently not recognized, like the care work that Black and brown women do for family members, for community members, for their children. All of that should be recognized and compensated in our economy. And then finally, that all people of color belong in our economy, and belong in our economy in all of our intersectionality, not just as Black people or Latinx people or Indigenous people, of course, but also as Blacks trans people or Black queer people or Black people who are immigrants or Black people who are disabled. And the same goes for every other group, that all of those things are things that are honored and bring us in so that we can participate in the economy in a full way. I'm going to stop there. I thank you all. I hope that this helps you springboard into a conversation about policy. I know you have a policy agenda that you're going to talk about, but I think I'll stop in there.